signed up, and so people will probably join us after we start. So we just did today's webinar, Tips for Managing an Unexpected Crisis. Since you're here, I wanted to mention that we have another webinar tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time called Bookseller Chill. It's the second of a 6-week series in which psychotherapist Brian Robinson offers tools for coping with the uncertainty of today. And he leads us in what he calls micro-chiller meditations. Bookseller Chill is a 30-minute webinar, and it's a really great way to exercise some self-care. We really enjoyed it last week. If you're not already signed up, please email me, lindamarie@sibaweb.com, and I'll send you the Zoom link. So everyone who is not presenting has been muted. Please ask your questions through the chat. And I encourage you to write your questions while John is presenting, and then I'll address them to him after his presentation. And now to introduce John Cavalier. John is the co-owner of Cavalier House Books and the Louisiana Book Company in Denham Springs, Louisiana, both of which he owns and operates with his wife, Michelle. Cavalier House Books is a general interest new and used store specializing in large school institutional orders and school book fairs. Louisiana Book Company is a regional wholesaler, distributor of books that share the history and culture of Louisiana. John is very active in his community and serves as community organizer for Denham Springs flood recovery efforts, as well as serving on the board of Denham Springs Merchants Association and the Livingston Parish Small Business Council. John is a staunch advocate for independent business, distributed economies, emergency preparedness, and climate resiliency. John is also a current member of the SIBA Board of Directors. So now I'm going to turn things over to you, John.
Well, great. Well, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for attending the webinar today. I hope everyone is doing as well as they possibly can be under these circumstances. I know we've certainly had an interesting go of it as of late. But yeah, so I've got a little PowerPoint presentation that we can go through with just a few slides of some things that I've found helpful, both during this crisis as well as in times past. We've certainly been through a few things here at our shop that have turned everything on its head for us. We've been through a few things that were completely unexpected. We've been through some things that were damaging and that looked hopeless, but then we were able to find the hope in them, and they made us all the stronger for it. So without any further ado, I'll share my screen here. And there we go. All right. Is that up? You guys can see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, it's always questionable. All right. Yeah, so so yeah, kind of I thought that, you know, I would start by just kind of sharing a little bit about how I think about emergency preparedness and planning and resiliency efforts. We went through a flood situation here in my town, Denham Springs, back in 2016, and afterwards, our city was lucky enough to be to undergo a long-term planning effort that was supported by FEMA and the federal government, and we were able to map a long-term recovery plan. And I volunteered with that for several months while we were gathering information and getting all of that together so we can have a comprehensive plan for the city. And one of the biggest things that struck me was just speaking to other business owners and speaking to other people in my town that, you know, how not resilient we were. Sorry about that, y'all. But trying to figure out how to make ourselves more resilient in the face of whatever would come in the future. And so the kind of the way that I think about planning and preparedness is that emergency preparedness and resiliency planning is not about having all of the answers, but it's about gathering the right tools. The difference between planning and preparedness in my mind is that, you know, with a plan, you tend to go from point A to point B, whereas with a mindset of preparedness, you tend to want to collect the assets and the resources and the capital and the relationships that can get you from point A to point B or point A to point Z. And so for me, I always just try to approach it from sound business principles, not overextending myself and making sure that I'm as organized as possible. Which that brings me to my second slide, was planning for an emergency is planning for an opportunity. That's one of the biggest things that I've really learned over the years, is that they're really no different. They both focus on making sure that you have sound financials, you have a sound footing in your business, that you're diversifying your revenue streams, you're seeking opportunities elsewhere, and mitigating risk is the two sides of the same coin. So it's really interesting to think about, and certainly we have a lot of time to think in this wonderful pandemic we're all experiencing right now. And that's where my mind has been pretty much in its entirety. I'm trying to figure out for myself and for my business, how am I going to come out of the other side of this and be stronger for it, and be a better asset for my community, and be a better bookseller and business owner and better citizen all around. So to kind of share with you guys why this is so important to me, I included a few pictures here. This picture that we have up now is actually, we had our first unexpected little disaster about 6 months after we opened our store. This was in 2010. We had an 18-wheeler wheel come off of a truck and bounce through our children's section of our store, which we had just opened up 6 months prior to this. So it was a huge shock to basically have to redo everything that we had already done. And from there, about a year later, our city undertook redoing all the sidewalks in front of our store, which, you know, of course, for the long-term go of it, it added to the beautification of our area, and we've got beautiful brick pavers outside of our store now. But there was about a 3-week or a month-long period where to get into our store, you physically had to walk across a plank, which was, again, when we were 1 year in business, this was a huge shock to us, and we had to learn to adapt very quickly. And it got us in the mindset of, you know, sort of, never again do I want to be in that position of helplessness, or wondering what to do, or, you know, feeling that sense of, oh no, sort of thing. And then this was another huge shock to our system. We had that, if everybody remembers the winter where we had the polar vortex that visited us every Wednesday, we had our entire book fair season disrupted. We had book fairs canceled. We had book fairs moved around. We had special events canceled, and it was just extremely disruptive for like a period of 2.5 months, and it left us scrambling. But every time that one of these things happened, it left us a little bit stronger and a little bit more prepared. And then this was sort of the granddaddy of them all for us. Well, kind of up until now, I suppose. With the flood that came through our community in 2016, where 90% of structures in the city of Denham Springs were flooded. And this is these are a couple of shots of the Denham Springs Antique Village, which is where we're located. You can see here in this particular picture that there's a hill, which fortunately for us, we're on the high side of that hill. So our store avoided any water, but our house here was different story. We got a couple of feet of water in our house, and the sheer devastation of everything. This is the scene after we were gutting everything from the house. And this was what you would see for miles. If you drove through any neighborhood, if you drove through by any businesses, you just saw the contents of them completely emptied out on the side of the street. So it's, we're well familiar with the, you know, the financial hardships that come along with this, but also the psychological hardships that come along. And it is absolutely brutal and can be absolutely devastating to your peace of mind and your own well-being if you let it. But there are definitely some things that you could do that there are definitely some things that you could do that really make it bearable in the short term, but can also make it, you could really turn a disaster into an asset in the long term. If you think about it right, if you get your head in the right space so that you can kind of batten down for the short term, but then plan for the long term to make sure that you're coming out of it at least as whole as possible. What I have here, I put together just some great resources I was kind of thinking in terms of this pandemic that we're all going through now. It's a really interesting sort of scenario because it's not a point in time where there was a disaster, like a physical disaster, like a tornado or a flood or a fire. But it's this really slow moving, really strange psychological phenomenon that we're all undergoing right now, on top of course, the medical emergency. And so, but what I was thinking about with putting this little list of resources on here was that, you know, just like a musician has to learn scales before they can go off and play a blistering guitar solo, kind of have to get the basics down first of thinking in terms of resiliency planning and making sure that you're safeguarding your assets, your staff, your community, and everything else. I'm sorry, y'all, this phone is driving me crazy. There we go. Sorry about that. But yeah, so these were some resources that typically, you know, ideally, you know, you'd be sitting in your back office without a crisis going on around you when you start looking at them. But of course, it is what it is, and we're at the point where we are. But your state and local Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness and your local emergency operation plans can be huge resources to start thinking about resiliency planning in a more holistic way, thinking about the way that your business fits into your community and thinking about the ways that you can contribute to that, and thinking about the ways that you could also benefit from that to make sure that, you know, whatever is going on, you're a part of it. Also, the ready.gov/business links that are listed there are also great plans, you know, for putting together the basics of what you need to kind of make sure that you're taking as many things into account as possible. And then the last thing, the FEMA Comprehensive Preparedness Guide, the Threat Hazard Identification Risk Assessment Guide, or THERA as FEMA likes to call it. It's technically designed for communities, but I was actually part of a group in 2017 that went through this with our city, and I found it extremely beneficial for myself and for my business. And I'll tell you why. Specifically, we were sitting in a meeting going down the list of threats and hazards that were present in our community, and the topic of a train derailment was brought up. And that was something that I had never thought of before, but we sure do have train tracks that cut right through the middle of the city. And our bookstore is literally located probably 150 feet away from the train tracks. And so it was just an idea of a potential hazard that I'd never thought of before. And it brought that into a whole new light and made me really think, like, well, what else am I not thinking of? What else can I do to make sure I'm as prepared as possible for whatever may happen? And then this next slide that I have here is, this is an infographic that was put out by FEMA that I saw and I wanted to share. You don't necessarily have to read all of the details. The reason I wanted to share this specifically was, you know, when I saw this infographic at a meeting that I attended several years ago, it struck me as to how, you know, it's not just a community, and in our case with the pandemic, it's not just the world as a collective that's going through it, but we're all going through this on a very individual basis. And for me, when I was reading through this several years ago, it really hit home to me that, you know, these basic needs, just because I have my basic needs covered doesn't mean that someone else has their basic needs covered. Just because I'm at one state emotionally doesn't mean that someone else is at the same emotional state. And it's really a progression that everyone is on individually, that everyone has to get through in their own time. And so that was the main reason I wanted to share this image with you, because it really hit home to me that it's, you could plan as much as you want on an individual basis, but until you're also looking around you and you're helping lift up people that are around you, and you're helping people to cope with things that are around you, and you're really actively participating in your community, you're really not going to be whole yourself until you're helping other people to be whole as well. And I thought, this is a really sort of not pretty, sort of bureaucratic way of expressing that, I suppose, but that's what I got out of this FEMA infographic anyway. And then getting on to some of the nuts and bolts of thinking and doing with regards to becoming more operationally resilient in the face of a crisis. So when I was I kind of started this by just making a big master list of just like everything that I could think of that would be helpful to do, whether it be something for your mental well-being or just something simple and tangible to do. And really, I decided to break them down into pre-disaster, during disaster, and then post-emergency situations, because not because that's necessarily the steps that you're going to, it's not the order you're going to take them in, especially not now that we're in the midst of something. But I do think it's interesting because it's with our current emergency, our current pandemic, we are in a situation where, if you look at the continuum that I had on the last page, those short-term, long-term things, there's just a whole lot more overlap than this, because it's such a slow-moving phenomenon that's just going to keep going for a little while, at least, hopefully a little while. And it's really, some of these things that I have listed before are just as relevant now, because in some ways this hasn't even started yet, because we don't know what the economy is going to do after everything medically is taken care of. So yeah, I'll just kind of go down the list, and I'll go down the next few slides, just not in too much detail, because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to get to any questions that you guys have. And of course, at the end, if you guys have any particular questions about any of these, I'm more than happy to elaborate with my own personal experience or any other comments I may have. So yeah, the first thing is the threat assessment and community research, as we were talking about with the little resource guide that I put together, the links on the previous slide. It's all about thinking about what could possibly go wrong. And one of the current things that I'm currently thinking about is the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic, but also here in the great state of Louisiana, we have hurricane season coming up. And I can't think of anything that would possibly be worse than for all this to still be going on, and then we have a hurricane happen on top of it, or a tropical storm, or even a bad thunderstorm or tornado or something. And so I'm trying to think of this in terms of, not that it could always be worse, because that's certainly a not fun way to put it, but but certainly I don't want to take it for granted that crazy stuff won't happen still, because I believe this pandemic is completely indicative of the fact that crazy stuff absolutely will happen, and absolutely is going to happen. So I try to take it in that vein. Then creating emergency operations kit, emergency contact lists, basically just getting the stuff together that you need to operate. For me, I've got my laptop, and it is my little mobile workstation. I've got everything from our Photoshop software to our accounting software to duplicates of our point of sale and everything else, with all my files backed up. And same with my wife's laptop, so that we're good to go wherever we are. Again, learning about local emergency operations plans and procedures, knowing where you fit into your community's response, whether you could participate in a response to something, whether you can contribute to whatever's going on in the pandemic now. You know, I was just reading an article earlier today about a lot of the distilleries down in New Orleans that have ceased operations for, you know, beer and spirits, and now they're making hand sanitizer and selling it directly to hospitals and medical professionals that need it. And so, you know, that was certainly something that I'm sure no one really thought of before all of this happened, but I would definitely, you know, they have that in their back pocket should they know if something like this should ever happen again. The next few bullets on here are just about relationships, knowing your insurance agent and your coverage, knowing your banker, knowing your credit reps. It's some of the most helpful things that we've done is just making sure that we protect those relationships and making sure that we're loyal to our bankers so that they're in turn loyal to us, and the same with credit and insurance reps, because when things go south, you don't want to go south by yourself. I would much rather bring my insurance agent with me, because that's what they're there for. They're there to work for us, to work on our behalf. We actually, during our flood, I had our flood insurance premium actually for our house was actually due on August 14th. And I remember this because the flood happened on August 13th. And I had it set up to automatically debit from from a credit card that we had. But because of the flood, I'd maxed out our credit card. And so the payment was declined. And so, but because our rep knows us, she got on the phone with me immediately, and we were able to get that taken care of. And it was just, that was the sort of added customer service and added benefit of having a relationship with her. That was, you know, well, you know, nothing practically would have happened because we would have had a grace period in order to reestablish coverage. It was just, it was a very big comfort in the midst of all the disaster to just have somebody calling you to look in on you and to help take care of you. Next couple, digitize documents and utilize cloud computing. Those are some of the biggest sort of labor intensive. Every time I get a new laptop, I download Google Drive, the backup and restore option, because we have every file that we have in Google Drive. And I do the backup and restore option rather than the file stream option, because I have those actual files on my laptop, and I have them across 6 different laptops. So I've got 6 redundant copies at my business and at my home. And I've actually got a couple in storage right now with our book fair equipment. And so it's good to know that I've got these redundancies in place, but it's also very comforting to know, you know, when our flood happened, we were evacuated to a place that had Wi-Fi, and I brought my laptop with me. And because I had my tax returns saved on my laptop, and because I had all of our accounting information, I had access to our profit and loss and everything, I immediately started applying for all the FEMA stuff that you've got to apply for. And I immediately started applying for all of the SBA stuff, because I knew that there would be a line. And I knew that it would be a long process of trying to get it fixed. So I was able to start early, and we were able to benefit earlier than if we had waited and waited for there to be a bottleneck. Communicating with your staff and neighbors, collaborating with your neighbors, absolutely super important to know where they're going so that you can go with them, and vice versa in the event of whatever's happening. You know, during our flood, we had one of our staff members actually came to our house because they flooded earlier than we did. And so it was, we had not planned that, but certainly in the face of emergency now, anytime something weird is going on, we have a conversation with our staff to make sure they know that we're there for them, and that where we will be and what we intend to do in case, you know, we could be a resource to each other. Organize and prepare your finances, assess debt, cash flow, liquid assets, balance sheet. That is part of that's the biggest part of how planning for disaster is the same as planning for an opportunity, because if you're doing that, you're going to be you're going to be prepared for whatever comes your way, whether it's negative or positive. If a tornado comes, you're prepared. If a pandemic comes, you're prepared as you can be on those fronts. Similarly, if an opportunity presents itself, those are the exact same things you need to do to be prepared to expand your business, or you know, pursue a different avenue with your business, or whatever you want to do. Which brings me to the next point: the diversify your revenue streams. That was one of the biggest things we did after the flood, and this is the biggest thing that saved us after the flood. Was our store wasn't in operation for probably close to 5 months after our flood. And so we had 0 sales coming through our storefront. And the only thing that got us through it was the fact that we did school book fairs. We were able to go to different parts of the state that were unaffected and make our money that way, so that we could keep the lights on and keep our space and keep rebuilding. You know, the situation we find ourselves in now with the pandemic is, you know, I really wish that I had spent some more time on our website and building it out, but that's actually what we've been doing over the past 2 weeks, is just completely redesigning our website and how we work with it. And we're utilizing this time to try to, again, diversify revenue streams by making sure that we are as present as we can be online. Whereas before, that was not something that had been a top priority, just because it didn't have to be. And then thinking long-term and planning for new, different economic realities. And that's the big uncertain thing that we're talking about right now with the pandemic, is what's the economy going to be like in 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? Because things like this change individuals, they change communities, and it's definitely going to be different. And the only thing that I could really suggest with that is that it's all on us in how it's going to be different. It's all in how we decide to make it, because we have these layers of abstractions that we put on ourselves, with everything from money to how the economy works and different societal constructs. But in the end, I think what we're seeing now is that it's all about relationships and closeness and love and generosity and support. And we just have to make sure that we're using those underlying values as we're rebuilding the economic constructs that we want to layer on top. So that brings me to think and do during emergency or opportunity. Be organized and pay attention. Some of these are just, you know, they're just, you know, it's obviously common sense stuff, but I mean, it's stuff that, you know, when you're filled with anxiety or when you're filled with doubt, it can be hard to kind of have that focus to pay attention to things, to just keep focused on things. And so it's always good to just sort of reiterate the obvious sometimes. But yeah, be organized and pay attention, focus on solutions, not problems, and work towards a goal. I'm trying to figure out where I want to come out on the other side of this thing, and I'm trying to work there, you know. Not that I feel a burden to be productive, you know, during this time, but I do feel like there's an onus on me to make sure that, you know, whatever happens, it doesn't go to waste. It's not in vain. You know, any struggles that we have to go through, you know, we go through them in order to be better. And so that's the way I feel about it. And so for us, you know, we're looking at coming out of this, and what we really want out of it is to be more connected to our community. And specifically, we're looking at it to be more connected to our schools and libraries, because they're doing the exact same thing with trying to stay connected digitally when they used to have a captive audience in front of them. Read all paperwork, document everything. That is just good practice for any of the bureaucracy you need to participate in, whether it be banking, federal government, what have you. The biggest thing that I've been looking at over the past couple of weeks is just how inconsistent the top-down message has been for all of the different government programs that are coming out and all the different support the government's going to be offering. It's all over the place. And so I try to read as much of it as humanly possible, because it is, I mean, it's difficult to decipher a lot of the time. And one account will vary differently from another account, which will vary wildly from yet another. So I try to just consume as much as possible and use my logic and reason to distill it into something coherent. Same thing with pay attention to the news and reading multiple sources. Discouraging hyperbole and disinformation, that's honestly a pet peeve of mine, which I'm sure it's a pet peeve of a lot of people. It's so easy for especially the internet to go crazy over something, especially if, you know, we've got some local Facebook groups that I try to avoid online, because I'll just pull my hair out if I don't. But I try to discourage it in every way that I can, and I try to make sure that whenever I'm faced with it, I try to make sure that I am presenting as much positive, factual information as I can, so that hopefully if there's going to be something that's, you know, that gets into an echo chamber, hopefully that will bear repeating over something that's might be, you know, out there. Work with trade associations, work with elected officials, work with neighbors, establish new relationships. That's a huge one, because our trade associations and our elected officials especially, they don't know how to work on our behalf if we don't tell them. Also, they're, you know, they are people, they have teams of people around them. They are also dealing with, you know, they're dealing with this pandemic on a personal level as well. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we contribute to that, and making sure that we raise our hand, so that if we have an idea or if we have a thought, to make sure, because in making sure that we're not left behind, we're also making sure that other people aren't left behind, because we have to make sure that there's room for discussion and there's room for conversation in any solutions that are offered up. Offer your talents and be dependable. Show up. That's another big part of it. I like to think that I will show up for anything that has to do with, you know, some sort of recovery or long-term planning, because it's in everyone's interest that we all offer our talents. There's an awesome book called Community by Peter Block, which I'll feature actually at the end of this presentation, but it's absolutely amazing in that, you know, one of the underlying principles in his book is that, you know, small groups are what changes the world. And when you're generous with your talents and your gifts is when you can have the biggest impact on anything. Tighten your belt, but consider others. Same thing. One of the things that we're doing is, you know, all of our friends that own restaurants, we don't have any money right now, just like everybody else. But one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to budget so that we could still support our friends that are also in the same boat as us, who are also trying to support us. So Michelle and I have budgeted a little bit of money so that we can make sure we go to our favorite Italian restaurant and our favorite restaurant across the street, so that we make sure that we're still trying to be a part of our community and contribute to it, contribute to the local economy in whatever way that we can, so that hopefully that we're examples so that other people do the same. There's always another problem or another opportunity. Keep preparing. And that's what I kind of hit on a little bit earlier, is that my wife loves me for this, because she'll always say that something can't be worse. She's like, oh, it couldn't get any worse. And then I'm always like, yeah, it could. You could be going through this and I could poke you with a stick right now. That would be worse, wouldn't it? And inevitably she gets angry at me. And, but I find it funny. But but anyway, in seriousness though, there are always things that can happen. And so just like, you know, I do worry like, okay, what if there was a hurricane that happened? I am also looking out for, well, what have I not done? You know, before all this happened, we thought that we had too many puzzles on hand for our book fair season. Turns out we didn't, because there was a pandemic on, and we've been selling puzzles like crazy. But you know, that's just a little bit of an example of the sort of shift in thinking that uh, comes with trying to open yourself up to opportunities that come along with it as well. And then cataloging responses for incorporating into future planning. That's just, you know, you're going to know your best practices, making sure that, you know, making sure those don't go by the wayside, because they can be invaluable when something happens down the road. And then finally, taking care of physical and mental health, which is unbelievably, it's challenging. It's challenging because sometimes it's hard to motivate yourself. It's it's hard to find the time to stop and think about that when there seems like there's so much to think about just with the world in general. But it's absolutely, for me, it's sleep. I have to make sure that I absolutely get enough sleep, because I will wake up in the middle of the night. I'll wake up at 2:30 in the morning and just start my day sometimes, if I feel anxious about something. So for me, sleep is a big thing. I try to make sure I get at least 6 solid hours every day. And then the last thing I had on here was Think Bank. We're incredibly lucky that we do have an organization that's dedicated specifically to us. And I know that in the past for us, they've been incredibly, they've been generous this pandemic with one of our booksellers. They've been incredibly helpful. They've been incredibly interested in helping. And so they are absolutely a resource that, you know, I was talking to Pam at Bank one time, and we actually had a limb go through the roof of our house, and I posted it on Instagram. And from that, I think Wanda or Linda Marie or somebody told them, and they called within a couple of hours of this happening. And they were like, "Do you need anything?" And I was like, "Yeah, well, we've got, you know, we got insurance. I don't think, you know, I think we'll see how it goes." And they're like, "No, like if you need anything, let us know. Like this money is here for you. It's here for all of us. Like it's to help with whatever we need." And so it's fantastic that we have a resource like that. And definitely if you need it, or if any of your staff needs it, I definitely encourage you to reach out to them if you haven't already. And then post-emergency. Whoops. Incorporate what you've learned, reassess finances, update your plan. It's all about just taking what you learned and incorporating it and going forward on a stronger footing. Stay in touch, making sure you maintain relationships with everybody that you've met. Me personally, I've been in touch with my congressman's office a couple of times throughout the pandemic, and I always make sure to try to make myself memorable to whoever I speak with. And I've spoken with a couple of legislative aides that were taking point on some of the small business issues in his office. And so I intend to follow up with them afterwards, you know, just to either say thank you or let them help me with something else. But I want to make sure that I stay in touch with them, because those people that are legislative aides now or that are administrative assistants, they're the ones that are going to be the congressmen in the future. And they're the ones that are going to come back home and open a business, and they're going to be partners in your community and the rest of your life. So I want to make sure, because you never know who you're working with, who's going to be, you know, have some sort of impact on your life in the future. Volunteer solutions and opportunity for your community. It's all about sharing, share, whatever you can do. You know, SIBA has been doing a great job with the office hours, being a resource for booksellers to come together. ABA has been doing the same thing through the teleconferencing or through email or the message boards. It's also been fantastic. I've learned several new things on the Indie Booksellers Facebook group recently I just opened I just signed up for a pirate ship account this morning for all of our media mail shipments. So it's incredibly helpful to have other people looking out for you as well, and for you to be able to reciprocate that. Communicate with trade associations and elected officials. Make sure that they know you appreciate what they did, and make sure that they are also following up on whatever promises that they may have made, or any lingering problems that may exist, especially with elected officials with that, because as you know, in politics, the crisis du jour gets replaced pretty frequently. Trim fat and build reserves, shore up fundamentals, just common sense sort of things, adopt new mitigation measures. And then the last item on my list here is think long-term and work with others. How did emergency or opportunity originate? And what underlying assumptions should be challenged or changed? And that is honestly how I've been sort of spending my mental energy, is figuring out how to restructure not just my business, but also my community. Like, what are some of the assumptions that we had that got us into this? And I've certainly got a ton of opinions and ideas about that. That could be another hour if I went on that tangent, so I won't. But and then to kind of sum it up, the last thing that I wanted to end with this was actually a quote that I heard on the radio the other day. Tragedy without transformation is truly a tragedy. And I would love to know who this quote could be attributed to. It was on a morning show on NPR, and it was a musician talking about how the virus was affecting, just the income of working musicians because all their gigs were canceled. And he had that wonderful quote. And I don't know if it was originally his, but that was just like the most perfect line that I could possibly think of. And so I wanted to share that with y'all as well. And then I'll leave this up for a second, and you guys can kind of look at some of these books. These are some of my favorite books that have kind of helped me through a lot of the mental obstacles that come with resiliency planning and preparedness and that sort of thing. But with that, that's kind of all that I had for my time here. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions or have any sort of discussion that you guys might be interested in.
Well, we do have a question. How do you keep up with everything on your list of think and do during an emergency? Do you have morning meetings, evening debriefs? Do you write yourself a report that you refer to? So, how do you keep center during this and catalog it?
Well, for me, my business partner is my wife. So, we have the benefit of being with each other 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And, it's not necessarily in like there's not necessarily a checklist that we're going off and saying, make sure we think about this and do this. It's things that occur to us. And for me, I use, my wife and I both, we make lists all the time, and I use a Trello board all the time. And so I've been, I already have a list of like long-term goals and short-term goals that I have on my Trello board. And so I just start incorporating those things. And it also really kind of changes my goals, because there are things that like I thought were important, a month ago, but now I'm like, oh, nobody cares about that anymore.
So Trello is a really important hub for your organization.
Yeah, we use it all the time. It's fantastic. And it's just a really intuitive sort of way to keep little lists of things. Anything from practical things like all this, like I've got all the stuff that I'm working on, like we're working on getting a lot of online book fairs up and running right now for several of our school librarians. But also I've got like my list of questions that I want to ask my banker about the payroll protection program, so that I've got it ready to go on my phone or whatever, so that I'll have all that information as I need it.
We have a question. Has anyone dove into the CARES Act and its application for indie booksellers. Have you worked with that, John?
Yeah, so I've read a lot about that, and I can tell you that, you know, the payroll protection program is something that we're going to be taking advantage of here at our store. Um, it's essentially it's a loan that's forgivable if it's used for keeping people on payroll, with a few other expenses like rent and utilities also being applicable and available for forgiveness. Um, and then there's also the economic injury disaster loan that's available from SBA, which can be used for a number of uh, uses. And so, yeah, the CARES Act really, it lessened the requirements for applying for a lot of that stuff, to make it easier to get money in people's pockets, essentially. And yeah, they're definitely, I'd be more than happy to go over it. It's insanely long though, and there are a lot of details. So if anybody has any specific questions, I'd be more than happy to talk to them about it via email or call afterwards, because that's one of the big things I've been following this whole pandemic, because there's been such inconsistent messaging around how it's going to be implemented, and how the forgiveness portion of it's going to come later down the road. So
Is Trello similar to Basecamp?
no, Basecamp is great for, Trello can be used for big groups. Basecamp is better for big groups, in my opinion, or collaborating on different threads of things. For me, um, Trello is easier to share with, like, my wife. It's easier to share with. It's more personal because I keep my Trello boards organized how I want. She can keep her Trello boards organized how she wants. And we can still share things, but, you know, if I have it labeled as something in my Trello board, she can organize it in however it fits in her, uh, you know, mind space on her Trello board. So it's a lot different, but it's essentially a system of, like, I think of it as like Post-it notes, where, like, you've got this board and you can just make like a crazy serial killer looking board of Post-it notes, except, you know, it's a productivity app.
Since you're a veteran of some disasters, have you noticed tools that you learned from other events that helped you, like, click into this one with more ease, maybe emotional or
Um, well, I wouldn't necessarily, it's more ease, because it's, you know, really self-awareness, I think, would be the biggest thing, because you've really got to realize, like, hey, how do I feel about this? Because I think one of the most human reactions that we all have is that we kind of ignore how we feel about things a lot of the times, or we try to put some sort of logic on top of something before we deal with, like, our actual emotional state and how we actually feel about whatever's going on around us. And so for me, you know, it's really tough, because, I mean, there's the part of the pandemic that's just unbelievably sad, and then there's a part of the pandemic that is unbelievably uncertain, you know, with the long repercussions of it. And so for me, you know, in, like, you know, something else bad is happening, like, the biggest thing that I realize is, like, okay, I need to, like, how do I feel about this? And coming to grips with that kind of faster, and talking about that sooner is very helpful. Because I know, you know, after our flood, you know, I had stress dreams for 6 months after our flood, that just wouldn't stop, and I would wake up, like, sweating every night, just from the stress of it all. And, you know, realizing that after the flood, I would say, is helpful now to me, just because I'm more aware of that and I want to be more mindful of it. But other than that, yeah, it's just trying to cope.
In our Bookseller Chill series last week, Brian Robinson discussed how your immediate response, kind of like the curve that you showed from FEMA, you can immediately respond from like what he called the lizard brain, or the primitive part of your brain. And you have to shift through that, because when you're in that part of your brain, you don't make the best higher level decisions. And so when you move through that process and everyone has their own pace, then you are able to be more creative and make better decisions. And you mentioned about taking care of your physical and emotional health is so important during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. That's a great book that's on that subject. It's about the two systems of thinking, where we do have this reactive nature where we just want to react to things, but then we're also, we're also amazing at stopping, taking a step back and being really contemplative about things and reflecting on, greater meaning of things. And so, yeah, his whole book is about how, our minds are essentially always at war with each other, because we always have two reactions at one time. And so it's, I find reading stuff like that to be helpful for me personally, because, we want to understand things. We want to be able to explain things. We want to have a vocabulary to assign things. And so, yeah, I've found a number of books like that extremely helpful as well.
You mentioned, I remember talking to you earlier about the last crisis, and one of the things you did that helped you for future events was you became much more involved in your local government. Didn't you say that you reached out and made new partnerships that you hadn't had before, and that helped you have more power and how you could be part of the response or make sure there were better things available to you and all small
Yeah. So after our flood in 2016, so in 2017, FEMA actually undertook this it's the National Disaster Recovery Framework is what they operate under. And they have a provision that for local municipalities or parishes or counties, they can take part in long-term recovery planning. That's basically funded by FEMA and supported by FEMA, in that they sent a team of people to work with it. And so I volunteered after our flood. I volunteered for about a period of 4.5, 5 months, full time, just working on the flood recovery effort. And, I learned, I met every single person that works for the city of Denham Springs, the parish of Livingston, and a ton of people that work for state agencies. And, made relationships with all of those folks that were a part of it. But also, it was a tremendous lesson in how government works, but it was also a tremendous lesson in how it doesn't work also. So it's extremely invaluable to meet with people, to meet with these people, because, not from a cynical perspective, but these people that are running our government, they don't know what they're doing. Like, they don't know what they're doing. They're making it up as they go along, just like the rest of us. So it's, everybody can always use another set of eyes or another set of hands. And if you could be that other set of eyes or other set of hands, it's invaluable to finding solutions or problems. And it's also just personally invaluable because you've got that relationship that you could build off of for the future.
John was part of we have daily office hours at SIBA now from 1 to 2, and people have been sharing some of the resources they've been using and investigating. And that's it. I would encourage you also to join us on the office hours, to share, and also share your questions. And if you're not getting answers to your questions, then SIBA can bring that to the ABA's attention, or you could ask the ABA directly. Because John, you were mentioning that the resources you're getting from the ABA are invaluable.
Yeah, ABA has been doing an awesome job, especially with like the CARES Act summaries and stuff like that, with putting out as much comprehensive information as possible. But, you know, one of the things I've been frustrated with this, this time frame over the last month is completely inconsistent messaging. You know, in Louisiana, we've got, you know, our two senators and my state rep, my representative for our district, rather. You know, I follow them on Twitter, follow them on Facebook, follow, you know, their news appearances and stuff like that. And it's mind-boggling how they could not be on the same page about something that's so important. But similarly, I'll mention that, you know, I was on my congressman does these awesome virtual town halls where you sign up and you just get a phone call, and you know, it's like this, except you're just on the phone and you can get in a queue to ask questions and stuff like that. And so I was listening to one of these virtual town halls for about an hour and a half the other day with, while I was just doing my work. And it's also amazing to hear because so many people had questions. And then I think I was one of 3 people that asked questions about the small business provisions of the CARES Act, whereas so many other people were interested in, you know, some of like the family leave and the medical coverage and the payroll protections and things like that, which is completely understandable. It's 100% understandable because, you know, that's their experience and that's, you know, where they're at in their worlds, and it's not where I'm at in my world. And so it's incredibly invaluable to participate in those sorts of things, because I mean, at least I was able to get another question asked about small business during that, you know, during that call. So hopefully we could still steer more conversation, but yeah, the fact that that information is so jumbled to begin with, I've been really pleased with how ABA has been able to clarify it, because, you know, even some of these, like my elected officials haven't been doing a good job doing it, at least.
Well, I think our hour has elapsed, and I don't see any more questions. So I want to thank you, John, so much for preparing the presentation today with all this information, valuable information that hopefully people can use. And I know as a board member too, that you're a resource that they can turn to you if they have certain questions that they need answers to. And we've also recorded the webinar too. Were you going to say something, John?
Oh yeah, I was going to say absolutely. If anyone needs anything, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to have a phone conversation or email or Zoom or whatever, because yeah, some of the most helpful things are just talking it through, you know, and that's always underrated and undervalued, but talking it through is gets you a long way.
And thank you all so much, all the booksellers, for showing up today too. I know you have so many other things to do, so I really appreciate you being part of our webinar series. And this will be the official end of our webinar. Maybe come tomorrow to our bookseller chill. It's just a half an hour, and you could write me, Linda Marie, at SIBAweb.com, and I'll send you the link to join. And we have SIBA office hours from 1 to 2 tomorrow, and we'd love to see you then too. And booksellers are sharing what they know at those office hours, so it's a great forum of community. So thank you all so much.